Has anybody checked out the videos on my YouTube channel? It's probably the lamest YouTube channel on YouTube. I just have to say. It's pretty lame. So no, we don't have a celebration, which I actually knew. I don't know. I wanted to keep you in suspense. I guess because I can. I don't know. Good stuff. Awesome. Hey, let's go. Go. Come on, you can do it. Da-da-da-da. Hmm. Yes, and I know you want to. I know that's the one thing you want to do with all your free time. I want to sit in on all of David's other classes. You might get a weird sense of deja vu when you're looking at the intro lectures because, well, they haven't changed a whole lot, to be honest, in the last few years. Although I did talk about COVID and how it affects the environment. I found some interesting stuff on that. That was kind of fun. Yeah. Well, so of course there's the piece where like air pollution is decreased. You might have seen those graphs on like pollution over China. Um, and and it was cool. And so also like sea turtles are nesting places where they hadn't nested before because people aren't doing the tourist thing out in places like Phuket, these beaches in Thailand. So I don't know. I kind of used it to make the point partly that like our natural ecosystems can bounce back pretty quick when we kind of take the stressors off. And I also thought it was kind of neat just looking at how like outdoor recreation increased, too during COVID, like after a while, which I think is good because it shows that like people want to be outside, and it shows how we value the environment. Um, yeah, what else do we talk about? I guess those are some of the main things. Oh, like just thinking about like COVID as like kind of showing how like we're all connected because I still do that case study in my intro course with the Alaska PCBs. I don't know if you guys remember that. I still do that case study that kind of makes a point that like everything's connected globally, and it's like kind of use COVID as like another example of that. And so, um, yeah, like and then we read and discussed the article on on why racism is killing the planet, and so that was a good discussion as well. Although that was funky with intro students because like a lot of them didn't know each other really yet, and it was kind of a deep topic to go into for someone that don't really know each other. The other thing I found, which is really annoying, is that I'm teaching in Carpin, what is it, room 38, and so it's got just all these plexiglass dividers everywhere, and like it's so funny because when somebody says something, I literally don't know who it was because their mouth doesn't move, and the way the sound bounces like off the plexiglass and stuff. Like I know the comment came from like this side of the room, but it's unless somebody's doing this as they're talking, like me, I don't know who it is. So uh, that's a good idea. I should do that. I should do that. Yes. So that was kind of interesting, and also like it's really hard to have discussions. Like in this classroom, we're 6 feet apart, so we can discuss with each other. But there they're not. So they just have these plexiglass barriers, and so we were doing a little like kind of pair up discussion thing the other day, and people were like talking like around the plexiglass, and I'm like, actually, like no, like I know that's hard to. So that's been a struggle in that class. I hate to do it, but I may have to really back down on like my little discussion-y thingies that I do. Cool. Um, yeah, all right. I don't know, any questions, comments, thoughts on stream ecology that you've had in the last, well, since our last class, I guess. Last what, is it 5 days? Is that what it is? Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, Interesting. So yeah, so are people collecting data on that already? Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, neat. Yeah, who was it? Maybe it was Isabel with research. Something in a stream we were like, yep, there's a disposable mask. There's a disposable mask. Yeah, crazy. And remind me, I like to bring a trash bag with us when we go out in the field so we can pick up some of that crap. And I didn't last time. I actually looked around for a trash bag before we left, but couldn't find any. So yeah. But if you have access to a trash bag between now and lab, feel free to grab one. And that's we won't have as much stuff in Beech Tree Creek, but there'll be some. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, yeah. Plastics are a real big issue. And if they go into the Swannanoa watershed, the bottom line is it probably won't make it to the ocean, just because we have so many dams along there. And they've done studies looking at plastic volume into the ocean, and there's very little that comes out of the rivers in North America. When you talk about like the gyres in the Pacific, it's like vast majority coming from rivers in Asia and Africa, and then getting carried that way. But yeah. So they just accumulate behind the dams in our lakes, which is probably just as bad, if not worse. Interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Streamy thoughts? Streams of consciousness, if you will. That's what we should call a reflection journal. Stream of consciousness. Yeah, you absolutely could. It's really interesting. I know the Savitsky article, which talks about sediment accumulation behind dams, asked the same question. Like if we didn't have all these dams on the Mississippi River and Tennessee and Ohio River system, like how much sediment and nutrients would get to the Gulf of Mexico? And the answer is a heck of a lot more. So yeah, so it's that's one way that you could look at it. And some of our streams here in Western North Carolina have these booms going across them that collect trash. And actually, one of our graduates was doing an AmeriCorps project that installed several of those. And so that's just another way of like trying to collect that junk before it gets in. So it could be a positive. Positive in a way, right? Okay, cool. So we talked about the river continuum concept the other day, and we're still thinking kind of big picture. So talking about water flow. And our discussion paper of the day talks about flow as being a master variable in loadic systems. So I was just curious, like, what do you think that means to y'all when you hear master variable? And then, like, how do we measure that in a way that's meaningful for stream organisms, right? Like, that's a lot of a challenge as a scientist. Like, you have a question you're interested in, but how do you generate some numbers that like meaningfully measure that, right? That allow you to evaluate that. So what does that mean? Like when you read that it's a master variable, like kind of what does that mean to y'all? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Other things are going to change because of flow. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So right. So the idea is that like when we look at the reason things are the way they are in a stream, flow is gonna play a role in a lot of ways. So how would we measure that? Like if you're going to a stream and you're saying, okay, flow is playing a big role in this ecosystem here. How am I going to measure that in a way that will describe its effects on the biota that live there? How might you go about doing that? Okay, so measuring the depth. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Poth in this article was talking a lot about the dynamic nature of ecosystems, right? So these rivers. So we could talk about depth. We could talk about sort of like the volume of water, sort of. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What else? So yeah, we're gonna do that. Actually, starting next week when we're sampling the fish, we're gonna measure. We're gonna quantify the flow velocity at a bunch of available points. Yeah. So flow velocity would be one way. So like, yeah, like the amount of water, the velocity of the flow. You have to think like a mayfly, right? Or think like a midge larva. or think like a river chub, right? Like what does it really, like you and I look at the stream and we think of it probably very differently than they would. So keep that mind and that question in your mind. And I'm going to mention a couple things. So one of the things we can look at is the stream discharge, literally meaning like how much water is moving past the stationary point at a given time. So we can talk about discharge volume. So has anyone taken hydrology? Cool. So you all have done this. How do you go about measuring stream discharge? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So what you need to do to determine the stream discharge, what you want to do is calculate, it's essentially the width of the river times the depth, which gives you like this two-dimensional plane across the river. And then you multiply that by the flow velocity. So like how fast that square area of water is moving. And so the units that we get are, you know, say we measure this in meters, this in meters, this in meters per second. So we're going to have meters times meters times meters per second. So we're going to have like cubic meters per second. So we're going to have a volume of water at a specific rate of speed. And so, yeah, so if you were to go to a stream and do this, it's exactly as Michael was saying, you would essentially divide the stream up into to panels, essentially. And for each of these little rectangles, you'd measure like the width of it, the depth, and other than the flow velocity, right? And so it's an estimate, right? Because, I mean, I don't know. We could take integrals or whatever and like estimate, but it's just an estimate, right? So of course, the more measurements you take, the better estimate it is. We measure velocity at 60% of depth. And we'll get back to why that is in just a second. But the bottom line is, we don't have to do that everywhere that we go because the USGS in many places, the US Geological Survey, has done that for us. And so they have gauging stations in these streams that, you know, they've calculated the curves that will tell them what the discharge is for a given depth of water. And so, you know, you can look up something like this. So this is a map of real-time stream flow all across North Carolina at all these gauging stations. And it's color-coded. So the blue and the black circles are high flow. And so blue is above the 90th percentile historically. That is, if we were to take a whole bunch of days in the past, 90% of them would have less flow than it has today. And so this is real time. So what does the western part of the state look like? Do we have a lot of flow or not too much in our rivers right now? Got a lot, right? All those dark blues. And so interestingly enough, all right, we have one of these at the North Fork of the Swannanoa River, which is just roaring right now. So we can click on that, pull up the hydrograph, and that'll show us over the last several days what the river has been doing. And it may be hard for you to see this depending on where you're sitting, but so this is today, right? And so it goes back a week. And it has these little yellow triangles, which are the median daily statistics, right? So the value above which half of your observations are and below which the other half of the observations are, right? And so, yeah, in the North Fork of the Swannanoa, it's way up above the median, right? The most common flow. And this is a log scale. So each line that goes up, we're increasing by an order of magnitude, right? We're multiplying by 10. So this might, so essentially, I'm sorry, it's each of these gray lines, oh no. What did I click on? Let's see, let me just do this. So, yeah, so each line is increasing by 10. Yeah. but it's not. But it isn't a linear increase. Okay, so you can see it peaked on the 21st, 4 days ago, after a rain event. What's 4 days ago? 20. So 21st was like, was that Friday? Monday. Yeah. So all the rain we had Friday, this shot way up. It's been coming down. Yeah. Actually, I'll tell you what. Just give me one sec. Dasha, let me just click on one other thing, and I'll go back. There's also one. Check this out, y'all. At Bee Tree Creek near Swannanoa, North Carolina. That sounds strangely familiar. Oh, it's because we're going to go there today. And so if we look at the hydrograph there, it hasn't been going as crazy. So the light blue rectangle or circle is in the what? So we're, between the 76th and the 90th percentile. So it's, it's up there, but not to a crazy extent. That gauging station for Bee Tree Creek is actually not far from the parkway. So it's upstream from Bee Tree Reservoir that it flows into and comes down. So, what we actually experience might be a little different, but it shouldn't be too high. Okay, so let me hop back over to here. And so what those numbers are telling us then on the USGS gauging station website is this, right? It's telling us, what is the volume of water moving past the stationary point. And again, you guys, it just blows me away. Like, I don't know, just the fact that like the amount of habitat you have to live in can like increase exponentially over a day or two, right? It's crazy. Like just like the dynamism that these stream organisms have to be evolved to deal with is crazy. All right, anybody need more time on this? Cool. I used to joke and say, if you didn't get it all, you can wait till it comes out on DVD. But now, like, it's actually like it's gonna be like the video is gonna be on there now. So I can be like, if you didn't get it all, check out my video. Hit the subscribe button below. No, I don't even. Yeah. I was watching this YouTube thing last night in the process of processing my videos. There was this guy fishing out in a kayak, almost got run over by a boat. And he does fishing videos, and that video got like 1,000 times more views than any of his fishing videos. That's what you got to do to be a YouTuber, you guys. Which I find funny because tubers are potatoes, right? So if you're a YouTuber, like, does it mean you're like you live on the ground and accumulate starch? I don't know. Yeah, you should do it. You should do it. And of course, the only thing is, if we have students, then we need like sign. But we could do that. Yeah, like I know. So I could take some videos if you want. Do some live streaming. I see what you did there. We totally could. Yeah, man, I'm down with it. If we want to think about that, yeah, we could poll the class, see if there's anybody who would prefer not to be live streamed, and and then other folks take videos. In fact, I'm sorry, you guys. I go off on tangents way too easy, and I'm gonna get back on track here. But it'd actually be really interesting to have a video on how to take a server sample, because there are some on YouTube. But I mean, it's nice to have your own. Or, take a picture of these modules and putting them in, like, or a video of these modules and putting them in, like, that'd be pretty cool. So if any of y'all in your groups, check with your group first, right? Because we're not allowed to post any images of someone without their permission. But yeah, check with your group. And if y'all are cool with it, maybe capture a short little video of what you're doing. And, we can, however you want to do it, you can put it on your YouTube channel and, like, share it with us. It'll be fun. All right, so thinking about flow and how it matters to aquatic organisms, Richter et al. In a review article talked about some ways that this is important. So one thing we want to think about is the magnitude of the flow. And again, this is what you get when you look at the USGS gauging station. How is that important? How is the magnitude of water moving by a point important? To streamy critters, to those that live in a live stream, to those that are constantly live streaming? Depth of the water? Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting lots of stuff washed down to them. So I did my PhD, part of it, on how like drifting invertebrates affect fish in the pool downstream. And my PhD advisor studies birds, and he was like, yeah, it's crazy. It'd be like in a terrestrial ecosystem, it'd be like if you're a bird and like there was this food like getting blown to you on the wind, and all you had to do was like come and like eat it, which is what fish do when stuff was washed down to them with this flow. Another thing to think about is the frequency of the flow occurrence. So maybe that high volume flow comes along like once a year or once every 5 years. Or maybe it's a seasonal thing that comes along pretty frequently, right? How often does that given magnitude occur? How might that affect species? Imagine one that lives in an area where you get a big flow, but it's only once a year. And the other ones, you get a big flow 5, 6, 7 times a year. How might that affect species differently? So yeah, certain life history events could be affected greatly by this. So we need an example of that in a second. So yeah, how often does that occur? And then maybe connected to that is how long does that high flow velocity event occur? So if you live in an urban stream like Sweeten Creek, you're likely to get hit with high volume events pretty frequently. But what can we say about the duration of those events? Would you expect those events to be extended and long, or maybe shorter? Expect it probably to be shorter, right? Because the water doesn't absorb into the ground. It gets washed off quickly. The river goes up really high. But then that water washes downstream real fast because we don't have anything to absorb it. So it comes up real fast, goes down real fast. We have a term for that. Stream ecologists talk about flashy streams, ones that go up and down real fast. The timing and predictability of that is going to be important. The connection to species life histories when you breed, when you're young, need certain resources, right, is going to connect to that. So, thinking evolutionarily, if these events are dramatic, but they come along regularly every year at the same time, well, you'd expect species to be evolved to deal with that. Like in Asia, we have the monsoon, which is this like incredible input of water, right? In these rivers. I'll show you some pictures sometime, but we were getting data loggers out of the Narani River, and when we pounded these in, we're in about 16 inches of water. And it was the last one I got out before we were done with our fieldwork for that season. And we were over there in a rubber raft, and I literally was like holding onto like the ropes on the rubber raft like this, and I had to catch the thing with like my toe. I caught the cable with my toe and pulled it up and got it just barely. So there was like 6 feet more depth in that river than there had been when we were there before. But it's regular, it's predictable, so all the species there are evolved to deal with that. And sort of referred to this already, Richter's 5th category sort of connects with the 3rd as well. Just this idea of like the rate of how fast the water flow rises and falls. I think it's nice for us to think in the context of Sweeten Creek and Beachy Creek now. And a lot of these we would expect to differ greatly between the two just because of the urban location of Sweeten Creek. Any questions or comments on that? So Richter is basically saying, if you measured this, you got a pretty good idea of how the flow, flow regime is going to affect species. I see a couple of people writing, so I'll just pause for a moment here. There was also one data logger I wasn't able to get out, and I was kind of hanging onto this boulder, and it was really strange because the water would like come up a couple inches and go down, and come up a couple more inches and then go down, kind of regularly. And when it came out, I was like, whoa, okay, we're all right. Well, but I couldn't get it. There's a no. All right, so this is a study looking at invasion success of trout that relates pretty directly to the flow regime. So Kurt Fausch, who was out at Colorado State, asked this question, you know, we have a species that's been introduced all over the world. Why has it been able to get established in some places but not others? And so that species is the rainbow trout. So rainbow trout are native to the western United States. They're not native anywhere east of the Rockies, but they've been introduced to a couple places. They're not native in Colorado, but they've been introduced and had moderate invasion success. They've been introduced in the southern Appalachians, and they do really well. They do really well in the southern Appalachians. So this is a picture of a rainbow trout that we collected in Browns Creek up near Silo in the South Toe River watershed. And whenever you catch a trout and it doesn't have a banged up snout and it doesn't have fins that show signs of damage, you know that's a wild fish. Because the fish that are stocked in our streams, have you all been to the fish hatchery there on the Davidson River? You know the one I'm talking about, hopefully. They're raised in concrete pens, right? And so they're bumping into each other, they're banging into the walls. So when you catch trout that all the fins are intact and the snout's not marked up at all, it's a wild fish. It's been born and bred in the stream where you find it. And we also find little baby trout like this too. So rainbow trout do really well in the southern Appalachians. Very high invasion success. Well, they've also been introduced into Japan in two of the islands, Hokkaido and Honshu. And Hokkaido, they do moderately well, but on the island of Honshu, they haven't been able to get established. So Fausch et al. Asked the question, might this relate to the flow regime? Because when you look at these streams, they don't look all that different. This is a little Tennessee River where they do quite well. This is the Jinsu River in Japan where they don't do well at all. And you know, just kind of squinting your eyes and looking at you see some of the same habitats. Some rocky habitats and riffles, some deeper pools. You're in the mountains. So you wonder, what is it that allowed them to succeed in the Appalachians, but not in this area of Japan? So Fausch et al. Measured a bunch of variables about the flow regime, a whole bunch of ones, all the ones that Baxter talked about, and then some others. And then they did what's called a principal components analysis. It's a multivariate analysis. It essentially says, here's 1,000,001 variables from 5 different sites, or in this case, more than that. Which variables actually matter as far as telling the difference between these sites goes? You know, which variables do these sites differ based on? And when they did that, it told them a couple things. It told them that these sites separated out based on the summer maximum flow and the winter minimum flow. There were some sites that had a high summer max and a high winter min. Other sites had a low winter max and a low summer min. And then there were some variables with regard to flooding that differed among these sites. Now, based on the abbreviations of sites here, was there any grouping among these sites based on the ones where the rainbow trout introductions failed? Yeah, exactly. So the sites on Honshu, very high summer max, as well as a winter minimum. And they sort of, and then more moderate was Hokkaido, where they did okay. What about the sites where they did well? See any similarities again? Based on this y-axis that relates summer max and winter min variation. So they did well in the southern Appalachians, and of course they're native to the Pacific coast. So when you look in the Pacific coast and you look at the Appalachian sites, a fair amount of overlap on our y-axis there. Yeah, so those Appalachian sites particularly, and I don't know which one this one was, yeah, those are very close to zero, right? So very close to sort of like moderate in the middle. All right, so then they looked at each of these sites, different sites in each of these areas, and they looked at their hydrograph. They looked at when there was when there was how much water in the river. And there's a lot of stuff going on here, but then in this column, they looked at the probability of flooding, essentially. And some of you might be ahead of me already here, but we've got our months from January to December. We've got the probability of flooding in these bars. And then we've got this little black bar here, right? That black bar, anybody know about the life cycle of trout? How do they reproduce? Right now? So they're nest builders. They use their tail to hollow out a little section of the stream bed. Then the female lays the eggs, male deposits the sperm, then the male covers it over again with the sand. And then several months later, those eggs hatch and the fry, the little baby trout, emerge. Now this black rectangle is the time of year when those baby trout emerge from the nests. Do you notice any similarities, and I apologize, this got cut off on top there, between the West Coast and the Appalachians as far as when floods occur and when those baby trout are coming out of the nests? What's going on? Yeah, the likelihood of floods are decreasing as these trout come out of the nests, these baby trout. What about Honshu, where they failed? Exactly. The floods are most likely to occur right after these baby trout have emerged from the nests. Yeah, so these are what trout fry look like. Pretty tiny. Not going to be able to do much when it comes to handling a high flow, right? Wherever the water goes, they're going. So this flow regime then can be real important at as sort of a coarse filter of determining what species are able to persist in these environments. All right, so yeah, interesting. Invasion biology, it's kind of like a natural experiment that kind of teaches us about these species, right? This idea that when the flow happens can be really important. Do you think flood frequency varies from year to year? It does. And there are fish that reproduce at different times of the year. So just a question to keep in the back of your mind is, if we go to a site and we look at the relative abundance of different fish species, theories like the principle of competitive exclusion might tell us that the number of fish you find there is based on the number of niches, right? And the abundance, right? If you have more of that species, it means its niche is more available, or maybe has a wider niche. But this is the importance of disturbance in these systems. Maybe that fish is really rare today, not because its habitat or its niche is not available, but because last year when all the young were emerging from the nests, it was an unusual flood at that time. So this has to do with what we call equilibrium and non-equilibrium theories of species diversity. And it means that we need to know something about the historical context, the disturbance history of a site, before we start looking at what's there today, at our snapshot of what's there today, and talking about niche availability and equilibrium and competition, those kinds of things. All right. Okay, so anyway, I'm going to move a little. Yeah, all this stuff. Like just, I don't know, a bunch of stuff. All these things that flow can do. Right? You probably know this. It can affect the shape of the channel, the substrate. So this disturbance through floods, droughts, and others. You know how hungry you feel after being at like the swimming pool for a day? Do you remember that? Like, man, you're so hungry. So now imagine you're a fish and think of how different it is hanging out in a high flow velocity habitat versus a low flow velocity. You're going to need to consume a lot more energy if you're hanging out in a high flow velocity habitat. So another way that flow is important is that when there's a lot of water in there, it's going to burn up more energy. What's that going to do to a species' feeding behavior? I know you're all rushing rapidly to write these down. I apologize. I don't know. You're going to need to eat more. Yeah. It's like, man, when you get back from the pool with your buddy, like those popsicles that you used to eat, like that's just not enough. Like they're nice, they're refreshing, right? Everybody likes a cold popsicle on a hot day, especially when you've been swimming in the sun for hours with your buds. But after the sugar rush of that popsicle wears off, like your body needs like some energy, right? So if species are going to be occupying these high flow habitats, they're going to need to be getting a lot more energy as well. So that's an important thing. Well, maybe that's okay if the flow is delivering your food for you, you know? Maybe it's okay hanging out in this high flow velocity habitat because maybe that's where the food is. Maybe those invertebrates are drifting down to you. And yeah, you got to expend some energy to hang out there, but they bring food to you. Can we extend that analogy to our swimming pool example? Okay, so it burns a lot of energy at the swimming pool, but there's like people that are selling insert favorite food here right next to the swimming pool. So really, if you want to eat the food that you really like, you're going there anyway. Although I don't think you'd have to jump in the water. Like you could just buy the, I don't know, the hot dogs. But you don't ask what's in the hot dogs, just buy them and eat them. And then, I don't know, there's other stuff you can eat too. So all these things are going to be important from flow, right? The shape of our home, like flow kind of determines the shape of your home. The disturbance, right? If you walk out your front door and get blown away, it determines how much energy you're going to have to expend just to be where you are. But it's also going to be delivering food, nutrients, and things like that. All right. And again, it can vary over very small scales. This is a stream up in the Hominy Creek watershed, up in like Candler area. It's a research project. I think it was like 2012 maybe. But you look at this stream, like what are like, and I think you all saw this at Sweeten Creek, right? That we have certain spots with real high flow, other spots with really low flow. So as an organism then, they have, quote unquote, a decision to make of where they're going to hang out. Low flow, high flow. Next to the UNC undergraduate research student or not next to the UNC undergraduate research student. Okay, so Jennifer Hill and Gary Grossman want to ask the question, what does flow velocity mean for drift feeding fishes? So they looked at the rainbow trout, not native to southern Appalachians, but now doing very well, thank you. And the rosy-side dace, which is native to this area. And they're both drift feeders. So they've got mouths out at the end of their heads, what we call a terminal mouth. That tells you they're not feeding off the bottom. They're feeding on stuff that's kind of coming at them at eye level. And so they wanted to see if you could mathematically predict the flow velocity that these fishes would occupy. Any math majors or minors in the crowd? it's kind of sort of right. Yeah, it reminds me of the physicist Richard Feynman. There's a book called "Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman." Hilarious, but he says, somebody asked him, they're like, I really love physics, but like I don't like math. He's like, well, like what are you gonna do when you find that the things in this world like follow mathematical equations, right? That you can predict it mathematically in lots of cases. So they want to do this for fish because, well, why not? So just a little bit of background. So optimal foraging theory. This is their first assumption. So optimal foraging theory, that basically says that natural selection is going to favor animals whose behavioral strategies maximize their net energy intake per unit time spent foraging. So if behaviors are sort of burned in by evolution, and you follow a behavior that does not get you much energy, you're not going to do as well reproductively as the other one who's getting more energy. In fishes, size often correlates with reproductive success. Females that are larger produce more eggs, so they have more young. Males that are larger, when there's competition involved, are successful. So being able to grow fast for all sorts of animals, but particularly fishes, can be sort of thought as like a proxy for like evolutionary success in fitness. So we would expect then that species would evolve to feed in ways that maximize their net energy intake. The amount of energy you expend foraging would be the least, and the amount of energy you get back in food acquired to be the most. So they asked that question for a drift feeding fish, and this is a brook trout. So if you're a drift feeding fish, well, we kind of talked about how flow might affect you. But what are the things you might need to think about, evolutionarily speaking, when deciding where to hang out in that stream to feed on drifting invertebrates? Like, how might flow affect your success as a drift feeder? Any thoughts? Yeah, there's some flow velocity where like it's flying at you. It's kind of like that booth at the game park where like the money's flying all over the place. It's like I don't know, what is it, $1 bills? You turn on the air and it's flying everywhere. Like you get to keep as much as you can catch, but you can't catch any of it because it's flying too fast. That's kind of like the drift feeding fish when the flow is going too high. It's like, man, there's all this fish flying, but I can't get it. Has nobody ever been in that booth where they do? I've seen it. I've never been in it. I kind of laughed because people were like, oh, there's all this. So that's one thing. If it's flowing too fast, you're not catching anything. What else? Kind of like the Goldilocks principle, right? If it's going too slow, there might not be any invertebrates. So there's some happy medium there. All right, so it's going to affect your capture success. And then there's the piece that we've already talked about where, if you're out in a stream that's moving too fast, you're going to burn up a ton of energy. So if you're not getting enough food back, then it's a negative, right? So your ability to capture prey is going to depend on how fast the water's moving. And and then as we mentioned already, the metabolic cost of hanging out there is going to vary with flow, right? But what about this piece? Maybe, where are you going to get? Are you going to get more energy from larger or smaller pieces of drifting food? Larger. So maybe there's an interaction there, right? Maybe you find the prey that's most energetically favorable to you, maybe in higher flow. Or I don't know, maybe just the ones you like. Maybe like you go to certain pools and they don't have the kind of food that you really like. So you go to the other pools to get the food. Or maybe some pools only popsicles are available, and that's what you like. Because if there was better food to eat, your parents would be like, no, you got to have like the pizza before you get the popsicle. But if all they're selling is popsicles, like you're getting popsicles. In this analogy, and in my son's perspective on the world, pizza is the good food. So some flow velocities will carry pizza to you. Others will carry popsicles. What else? Like, I don't know. What are some vegan options? Salad flowing downstream. Dressing makes it really messy. All right. So Hill and Grossman then brought these fish into the lab, gave them little white coats, had to fit them properly on the different fishes and their size, and then they put them in these tanks, and they started manipulating flow velocity. Scientists are very manipulative, you guys. And so they started drifting prey, and they looked at the ability of these fish to capture the prey. So on the x-axis here is current velocity, and then capture success. And don't worry about these different colored lines for now. But in general, what's the relationship between current velocity and capture success? There's a correlation. Yeah. And what happens to capture success in general as flow gets higher? Yes, it decreases. Sorry, that may have been too simple. I wasn't insulting your intelligence by asking that question, was I? Yeah, right? So when flow velocity is 0, surprise, they capture everything, right? They catch everything. And then as it gets higher and higher, until when you're at 25 or 30 centimeters per second, based on different prey, like you're not getting much of them at all. So here was their model. They said, okay, let's look at the benefit or cost to these fish, and let's look at the current velocity. So let's look at the benefit. So at 0 flow velocity, you can catch it all, but there's not going to be any drifting. Nothing's going to drift because the water's not moving. However, as velocity goes up and up, you're getting more stuff washed into the stream, but above a certain velocity, you're not able to catch it. Right? So we have kind of like a bell curve-ish looking thing here, right? Where at really low current velocities, not much benefit. At really high current velocities, not much benefit. Then they looked at the energetic cost of hanging out in these places. And as you might expect, it just increases, right? When there's no flow, you don't have to expend much energy to hang out. When there's lots of flow, you do. So their idea was that trout and dace would occupy the habitats that maximize their energy gain. In other words, that had, relatively speaking, the biggest difference between benefit and cost. Does that make sense? Cool. And so then some other things. So they plotted this theoretical net energy gain and the current velocity where it was highest. And they said, okay, we'll pick 10%. We'll just say within 10% of like the maximum energy gain, we'll say that like that's where like these trout should hang out. And they just kind of said that. And so then between about 8 and like 19 centimeters per second, like that's where these fish should be chilling. Then, this is the fun part. Like, I think all that stuff in the lab like would have been kind of crazy. But then this is the fun part. You go out into the stream, you find where those feeding fish are hanging out. And they actually went out with snorkels, they observed the fish, then they put a marker where they saw them, then they went back and measured the flow velocities, right? To see literally the flow that's like hitting that fish in the nose. Like, what is that flow? And so they found that for trout, there's a 100% match within their measurement error. But that's where those trout were. Now, dace, most of the time were there, but not all. One question that I had, just looking at this now. Anybody have any questions about those results? So they're basically saying like trout are selecting the most energetically beneficial habitats, right? Are you all cool with that based on what they've presented so far? Another thought just occurred to me now. Easier? Maybe. I mean, like any species, they're going to go extinct if they do things that are energetically unfavorable. But it's interesting to think that they probably evolved these behaviors in the Pacific Northwest and then came here. So I'm thinking like, I don't know, dude, like it's occurring to me that these flow velocities are pretty common in the stream. And so I would like to see, like, of the available habitats, like how many of them fell within this range, right? So cool, the trout are here 100% of the time, the dace are here 75% of the time. But how many, but if you were to just throw like 1,000 random points in that stream and sample them, what percentage of those would have been in this range? Yeah, maybe just, I don't know. I guess I'm just wondering like what was available, you know? Like if, anyway, I just would have liked to have seen that. Okay, and I'll have to go back and read the paper. They probably talked about it and I just forgot about it. Now, what if I told you that trout are big and dace are small? Would that have some way to explain the fact that dace are in these habitats 75% of the time and trout are in them 100% of the time? What are these dace doing when they're not feeding? Besides reproducing, which already knows. Escaping predation. And what we often see in nature is that behavior is a balance between feeding and keeping from becoming food. Now, trout have predators too. I mean, aerial predators are kind of a big deal. But I just think it's interesting that these smaller fish, which have to be thinking about being eaten by trout and other things, are not in those habitats as much as the larger ones. Cool. All right. So back to the question of how do we measure flow velocity? So if we look at a stream and we look at like the vertical profile, right, from the surface to the bottom, where do you think the flow velocity is lowest? The bottom. Why the bottom? Good. Yeah. So what we see is that at the water's surface, flow velocity is pretty high. Then it declines to a theoretical prediction of zero flow right against the rock at the bottom of the stream. If it's a non-eroding solid, then theoretically there's a flow of zero in the molecules that are right up against it. And so it looks like this. So our highest flow is up in the top of that water column. Now, there's a little bit of drag at the surface because of air, not that much. So that's happening. So when we go and we want to measure flow velocity to determine like a stream discharge, we want to measure at the average of that water column. And yeah, we'll do this next week. And so the average is at 60% of depth. So our flow meter that we'll use to measure flow velocity has kind of like a little yardstick kind of measuring thing on it. And so we're going to estimate, we're going to put it down about halfway in the water column to measure like the average. But what I think is super cool, like, I don't know, like especially invertebrates, like we have a lot more living on the bottom of the stream than up in the water column. So like if I measure my flow velocity in the middle, does that necessarily measure the flow that those invertebrates are experiencing here on the bottom, especially if it's rough? It doesn't. So what's interesting is that like thinking like an invertebrate, like, dude, we'd have to measure velocity like on really micro levels on the bottom of the stream to see what they're actually experiencing. Fishes that are hanging out in the middle of the water column, like, okay, that kind of makes sense. And you don't need to know all this. Just realize that there is this layer on the bottom of the stream that's called the roughness layer, this turbulent flow. Turbulent means we've got little eddies, we've got all kinds of little like redirected flow behind rocks, in front of rocks. And the flow in this roughness layer on the bottom of the stream is not a function of the average flow in that water column. All bets are off. Does that make sense? So flow, while it is indeed a master variable, is really hard to measure in a meaningful way for things that live in that roughness layer. It just is. Things like water pennies, for instance, right? Flat invertebrates. Some of y'all saw those heptageneid mayflies that have like, they're real streamlined and their legs, instead of being under their body, are like out like this. So they crawl like this. They're way down on the bottom. They're not experiencing this average flow at all. Same as this water penny, which have no monetary value, I'm sorry to say. Not even in water, which they should. What? Do mermaids use them? Okay. I figured that's probably where the name came from, but I wasn't positive. Don't worry about that. Why am I doing? Okay, the last thing I want to say here is that these catastrophic flow events, when you have lots and lots of water, these affect everything. Like people get things out of the way, out of the water when this happens. So how do you think benthic invertebrates respond when there's a real high flow event? They could burrow. The main thing that they do is to essentially to move because some of them can burrow. So they try to avoid unstable substrate, so things like sand and gravel. And we've been talking a little bit about drift. A lot of invertebrates actively enter the drift. They climb on top of the rocks and then jump up. And then it's kind of like when people moved from the eastern United States out to the west. They didn't know what we were going to find when they get in those covered wagons and went down the Oregon Trail. Nobody knew. All they knew was they were entering a new frontier. It would be new, to them at least. It was not so new for other people, but that's a whole other story. Invertebrates are the same way. When they're in a habitat where things aren't going so well, they jump up, enter the drift, move downstream. There may be a hungry trout waiting downstream, in which case it was not your day. But the other thing is they may settle out in favorable habitat. So as flow increases, these invertebrates are going to seek out low flow areas, either by crawling to them or by drifting. Because if you drift, you're going to get carried to these backwater areas eventually, right? And hopefully settle out there. They do that. As far as fishes go, they're also going to seek out shallower, slower flowing habitats. Haha, I got these a figure from one of my papers. There's a study we did in Kansas where we looked at all the fishes that occurred at a site and the depth that they occurred in and the flow that they occurred in relative to what was available. And essentially, as stream discharge increased, they used, relatively speaking, slower and slower flow. So they got out of that high flow area. And as discharge increased, they used essentially, it was a shallower and shallower habitat, the way I calculated this. So think of it this way. If you're a fish, you might be hanging out in the middle of the channel. But then as the water comes up and up, you're going to go kind of out toward the banks. So you're going to find progressively slower flowing water and shallower water. All right. Okay, cool. Any questions, comments, rants? They have to be kind of short rants, but they could still be rants. Is rant short for something? It seems like a word that's short for something. It sounds like blog. Like I went on my blog and went off on a rant. All right, yeah. So when I read this Poff et al. Article in grad school, I was kind of like, whoa, mind blown. But now it's like, yeah, of course. So they make this point that river flow is a master variable. affecting all these different things, pretty much everything, as we talked about. And then they go into this idea of how people have modified flow regimes through damming or changes to land use. And they claim that sort of current management practices don't try to reestablish natural flow regimes so much, focusing on other things. And so they argue that this is really where we need to be. When it comes to conservation, we need to be thinking about mimicking the natural flow regimes. So I guess the first question I had from this paper is, why might managers have ignored, if that's in fact what they've done, the importance of natural stream flow variability? Any thoughts on that? Oh, sorry, yeah. Brian and then, yeah. That's a great point. Like that map of USGS gauging stations, like a lot of rivers, we don't have them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Torin, what were you going to say? Definitely. Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. There's this interesting thing called the shifting baseline, which is like we think of natural as what we experienced growing up. And it's like, well, it's kind of been this way my whole life, so that's just the way it is, right? And the longer we get from those times in the 50s, 40s, and 50s, when we built all these dams, the more we don't even remember what these rivers were like, right? So, yeah. So, yeah, they mentioned that part of there was this focus on ecological integrity from the Clean Water Act. And they spent a lot of their paper like trying to relate the flow regime to ecological integrity. And yeah, I think they were focused on reducing pollution, all these sort of things. And then it's like, oh, the water, the actual volume of water can be different too. What are your thoughts? Like, how might altering the flow regime affect energy processing? So thinking of like the river continuum concept, right? And this idea of energy input from outside the stream, upstream, process moving downstream, autochthonous in the middle sections, and then heterotrophic later on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and right, and I guess the converse is true too. Like when you have dams built, then like it'll capture all that stuff, right? It won't let it move. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about like how the whole RCC is dependent on species being there, and so if you have some reason, if you don't have all the shredders and the headwaters, then it kind of falls apart, right? So yeah, and insects, right? So y'all know aquatic insects, the adults are winged, right? And so they can most insects can fly around dams, but fish, for instance, they can't. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Thinking back on the RCC and how it might be affected by flow regime. Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And they talked about salt cedar out west getting established on the floodplain, where if you had regular floods coming seasonally, it couldn't because it would get washed out. But then when we have dams, in the Colorado, then it can. Yeah. So changing again, like right, the invasibility with the rainbow trout. This is the flip side. if you've manipulated and altered the flow regime, then all of a sudden the non-native species can take over. Yeah. So I know we're about out of time here. Got a little bit of a late start here on the discussion. My apologies, but anything else that sort of struck you or you had a question about from that paper? We can talk about it out in the lab too. Out in the lab, out through those doors. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and keep posting these summaries on our class Moodle page. And, just so you know, when it comes to exam time, like I usually ask you to know kind of the take-home message of each paper. Not all the details, all that sort of thing, but just like the take-home message of the paper. So I'm going to post these on our Moodle page. And those of y'all, when it's your turn to lead discussion, if you could just share with me your summary as well. I'm only posting those.